What made the kindest mechanic in our county suddenly start charging top dollar to people who used to pay him in handshakes? My Uncle Walt ran the only garage in town for over 30 years. He learned the trade from his own father and took over the shop the year he turned 21. Walt never posted a price list anywhere. When you brought a car in, he would look it over, tell you what was wrong, fix it, and then ask what you could pay. That was the whole system. A single mom would hand him $40 for a brake job, and he would nod and tell her to drive safe. The school bus driver brought in his pickup every spring, paid in fresh tomatoes from his garden, and Walt would shake his hand like it was a fair trade. Nobody in our town ever drove a broken car. If you couldn't pay that week, Walt told you to come back next month, and if next month never came, he just smiled and forgot about it. He fixed the mayor's daughter's transmission for free when she was 16 years old. Reverend Lewis Buick kept running for almost a decade because Walt never charged him a single dollar. Everyone in town knew this about him. That is what made what happened next so hard to swallow. One night last March, a grease rag caught on something near the back heater. Walt was already home asleep when the call came. By the time the volunteer fire department got there, the whole building was gone. The lifts were warped beyond repair. The tool chests his father had passed down to him were melted shut. His paperwork, his parts inventory, his customer records, all of it gone. Insurance covered maybe a third of what he needed to rebuild. Walt stood out front the next morning in his work boots looking at a pile of black metal and didn't say a word for almost an hour. My cousin Freddie set up an online fundraiser that same afternoon and shared it everywhere he could. The goal was $40,000. 2 weeks went by. The fundraiser sat at $312. Walt didn't ask anyone for anything directly because that wasn't his way, but Freddie started calling around. Doug, who had brought his work truck in every other month for 12 years and paid maybe half of what the repairs were worth, said he was tight right now and could maybe chip in next paycheck. Linda from the flower shop, whose minivan Walt had basically rebuilt from scratch for the price of a few bouquets, said she had been meaning to donate but kept forgetting. The Reverend said he would mention it during Sunday service and never did. Joe, who ran the diner where Walt ate breakfast every single morning, said times were tough for small businesses right now. The mayor, whose daughter was now 30 and driving a leased luxury car, never returned a single phone call. A month went by. The fundraiser sat at $400 even. Walt was sleeping on his sister Nia's couch because his apartment had been above the shop and that was gone too. About 6 weeks after the fire, Walt borrowed his old buddy's 2-bay garage on the edge of town to start taking jobs again. Doug was the first one to roll in. The engine on his truck was making a grinding noise. Walt fixed it, replaced the alternator, did the work he always did. When Doug asked what he owed, Walt told him $300. Doug frowned. $300? Walt, come on. You used to do this for $1.50. I'm helping you out by even bringing it here. The new place out by the highway charges way more, but I figured I would give you the business. Walt stared at him for a long second. Then my uncle wrote up a receipt for $150 and handed it over. Doug paid, slapped him on the shoulder, and told him it was good to have him back. The next car was Linda's minivan. She needed new tires and an oil change. Walt gave her the friend price. Linda paid in cash, complained about how expensive everything was getting these days, and asked if he could throw in a wiper blade for free since she was such a loyal customer. Walt threw in the wiper blade. That same afternoon, the mayor's daughter showed up. The Lexus had a coolant leak. Walt traced it to a cracked reservoir and told her the part plus labor would run about $400. She scoffed. Walt, I have known you my whole life. My dad sent me here because he said you would take care of me. Knock it down to $200. I'm sure you can do that for me. My uncle didn't say anything for almost a full minute. Then Walt asked her if she had seen the fundraiser. She said she thought she remembered seeing something about it. He asked if she had donated. She said her dad probably had. Walt knew the donor list by heart at this point. There were 43 names on it, and not a single one belonged to anyone he had ever fixed a car for. My uncle told her the price was $400. She told him that was ridiculous, and she would take it somewhere else. Walt nodded and handed the keys back to her. That night, Walt sat down at Nia's dining table and told her something had shifted in him. He looked at Nia across the table and said, I added it up. 30 years. I gave away close to $200,000 in labor, and $400 came back. Nia didn't answer right away. She just sat there with her hands wrapped around her coffee mug, staring at the table. Finally, she said, I support whatever you decide, Walt. You know I do. But this town is not going to take it well. You know how people are around here. Walt said he didn't care how they took it. Nia said, I know. I'm just telling you to be ready. My chest got tight because I knew she was right. These were people who had been getting free and cheap work for 30 years. They weren't going to hear fair price and think it was fair. They were going to hear it and think Walt owed them something he was suddenly taking away. The next morning, Walt sat down at Nia's computer and asked me to help him look up what other shops in the area charged for basic services. We went through about a dozen shops within 100 miles and wrote down their rates. Then Walt made his own list. When we put his numbers next to the others, his prices came in slightly below average. Not the cheapest, but definitely not high. Just normal. Just what the work actually costs when you factor in parts and time and the fact that a man needs to eat and not sleep on his sister's couch forever. Walt printed the list on a regular piece of paper, drove out to the borrowed garage and taped it to the wall right next to the door. He stood there looking at that piece of paper for a long time, his arms crossed, his jaw tight. Then he said quietly, my dad would have hated this. I knew he was talking about Maximus, who had taught him everything and who believed that a mechanic's job was to keep people moving, not to get rich. So I told him, your dad never slept on a couch because his whole life burned down. Walt looked at me. He didn't say anything back, but he didn't take the list down either, and that was enough for me. Doug came back within the week. His truck was leaking oil. He pulled in, saw the price list on the wall, and squinted at it like he was reading a joke he didn't get yet. Walt quoted him the listed price. Doug laughed the kind of laugh people do when they think you're bluffing. He said, you're still doing this little act? Come on, man. We go way back. Walt didn't laugh. He didn't smile. He just stood there with his hands in his pockets and said, the price is the price, Doug. Something in his voice made Doug stop laughing pretty quick. He pulled out his wallet, counted out the money, and handed it over. But he didn't shake Walt's hand this time. For 12 years, Doug had ended every visit with a handshake like they were old buddies closing a deal, and now he just shoved his wallet back in his pocket and walked to his truck. On his way past me, he muttered, your uncle's changed, and not for the better. A few days later, Linda called to schedule her daughter's car for an inspection. Walt gave her the listed price over the phone. There was a long pause. Then Linda said, Walt, I bring you flowers every Christmas. Doesn't that count for something? Walt told her. Flowers don't cover the cost of brake pads, Linda. I heard the click when she hung up without scheduling. That evening, Freddie called. His voice was flat and nervous at the same time. He told me the fundraiser had gone down by $20 because someone had withdrawn their donation. He said people in town were talking, and the talk was not good. They were saying Walt was using the fire as an excuse to jack up prices, like he planned this. I felt sick. The idea that anyone could look at my uncle and think he set that fire on purpose just so he could start charging real money made me want to scream. I sat on the edge of Nia's couch in the dark for a while thinking, $400 in donations, a price list that matched every other shop in the county. And somehow, Walt was the villain. They weren't mad because the prices were too high. They were mad because the prices were real. The next morning, before Walt was even awake, I went to the hall closet at Nia's house where she kept old boxes. Underneath everything, I found a cardboard box full of notebooks, the cheap kind with the black and white spotted covers. Walt had been logging every job by hand for years. The car, the customer, what was wrong with it, what parts he used, what those parts cost him, and what he actually charged. Some entries said things like, replaced water pump, part cost $87, charged $40, customer said that was all she had. Others just had a name, a dollar amount, and a dash where the payment should have been. I carried the whole box to the dining table and started going through them. The oldest ones went back about 15 years, so I didn't have the full 30, but 15 was more than enough. I got a calculator, a pen, and a fresh notebook, and I started adding things up. It took most of the day. Nia brought me a sandwich at one point and looked over my shoulder but didn't ask what I was doing. She could see it. The numbers were right there in Walt's own handwriting, and they told a story that would make anyone sick. In 1 year alone, Walt did over $60,000 in labor at market rates and collected less than $18,000. My uncle gave away more than $40,000 in work in a single year, and that wasn't even a bad year. Some years were worse. I made a chart. On one side, what the work was worth. On the other, what Walt got paid. The gap was so wide it barely fit on one page. I sat back in my chair and stared at it. I always knew Walt was generous. Everyone knew that. But seeing it written down in his own handwriting year after year, it hit different. Walt went to the diner that morning like always. He sat down at his usual spot at the counter, the same stool he had been sitting on every morning for probably 20 years. But this time there was a little plastic reserved sign sitting in front of it. Walt had never seen that sign before. Nobody had, because Joe didn't take reservations. Walt didn't make a scene. He just looked at the sign, picked up his jacket, and walked over to a booth by the window. His coffee came late. When his eggs finally showed up, they were cold. Not room temperature, but cold like they had been sitting on the counter for a while before anyone bothered to bring them over. Walt ate them without complaining, paid his bill, left his usual tip, and walked out. He did not say anything to Joe. He did not look at Joe on his way to the door. He just set his money on the counter, folded the receipt, put it in his shirt pocket, and left. That night, Nia got a phone call. When she hung up, she came and found me with her face tight. She said Julius had finally called back. Not Walt. He called Nia. And he didn't call about the fundraiser or to see how Walt was doing. He called to let Nia know that some people in town had raised concerns about the borrowed garage not meeting county code. He said he couldn't promise Walt would be able to keep working there if someone filed a formal complaint. The way she described it, Julius sounded very official, like he was just passing along information, and it had nothing to do with him personally. But we both knew what it was. This wasn't about building codes. This was about a town that had been getting free labor for 30 years trying to punish the man who finally stopped giving it away. I drove out to the garage the next morning. I found Walt on his back on a creeper under a sedan, his boots sticking out, his radio playing something old and quiet. He rolled out when I called his name and wiped his hands on a rag. I had the chart with me, the one I made from his notebooks. I unfolded it on his workbench and told him to look at it. Walt leaned over the paper and didn't say anything for a long time. His eyes moved across the numbers slowly, line by line, year by year. Finally, he said, I knew it was bad. I didn't know it was that bad. His voice was almost a whisper. I asked him what he wanted to do. He straightened up and looked around the garage and said, I want to keep my doors open. That's all I have ever wanted. I took a breath and told him I had an idea. I wanted to print the chart and tape it right next to the price list on the wall. Not put it online, not send it to strangers, just put it right there where every person who walked in would have to look at it. Let them see what Walt gave and what he got back. Walt shook his head before I even finished. He said, that feels like begging. I told him, it's not begging, it's the truth. Let them look at it and tell you to your face that you're greedy. Walt got quiet. He looked at the chart, then at the price list, then back at me. He didn't say yes. He didn't say no. He just nodded once, slow and small, like he was giving himself permission to stop being ashamed of what the world owed him. We printed the summary that afternoon and taped it right next to the price list, smoothed out the edges, and stepped back. For the first few days, customers would come in, glance at the price list, and then their eyes would drift over to the summary. You could see the moment on their faces when they understood what they were looking at. Most of them turned away like they hadn't seen it. A trucker who came in with a belt problem on his rig read the whole thing top to bottom while Walt worked. When Walt handed him the bill, the trucker shook his head and said, you charge less than any shop I've seen in the last 100 miles. Most guys out there would have hit me for double this. Walt just said, thank you. I appreciate the business. Then Heloise came back. I heard the Lexus pulling in too fast, tires crunching on gravel, steam pouring from under the hood like a kettle left on. The coolant leak had gotten worse, just like Walt told her it would. She stepped inside and her eyes went straight to the wall. She saw the summary. She read it. I watched her face go from annoyed to something harder, tight around the mouth and eyes. She turned to Walt and said, what is this supposed to be? Some kind of guilt trip? Walt didn't answer. He was already looking under the hood. So I answered instead. I said, it's a record of what your free transmission actually cost my uncle. She said, that was years ago. He offered. I said, and when his shop burned down, you didn't even offer back. She didn't have anything to say to that. Walt told her the same price he had told her before, $400. Heloise pulled out her credit card and paid without another word. But on her way out, she stopped in front of the price list and took a photo of it with her phone. Just the prices, not the summary. I knew exactly where that picture was going. Then Freddie called on a Tuesday night, his voice shaky in the way that comes from being scared and angry at the same time. He said someone had filed an anonymous complaint with the county about the garage. They were sending an inspector out in 2 days. If the garage didn't pass, Walt was done. He couldn't work there. I sat down because my legs forgot how to hold me up. I didn't didn't need to ask who filed it. It was Julius, the mayor. The man whose daughter's transmission Walt fixed for free 14 years ago. The man who never returned a single phone call about the fundraiser. He would rather shut Walt down than let him charge fair prices and move on. Because if Walt won, Julius and his family would have to sit with what they did. And Julius would rather see Walt lose everything than sit with that. I found Walt the next morning sitting on an overturned bucket near the back wall right underneath the summary and the price list, his hands hanging between his knees, staring at the concrete floor. He said, "Maybe I should just stop, sell the tools I have left and find a regular job somewhere." My chest hurt hearing that from a man who had been turning wrenches since he was 15, who had grease under his fingernails at his own father's funeral, who didn't know how to be anything other than what he was. I looked up at the wall, at the numbers in his own handwriting. 15 years of proof, $200,000 given away, $400 returned. I turned to Walt and said, "No, we are not done yet." That night I pulled up Lou's number on my phone, the old Reverend, the man whose Buick Walt had kept running for almost a decade without ever seeing a dollar. I said, "Will you tell the truth about what my uncle did for you?" Not to me, to other people, just the truth. The silence on his end lasted so long I thought he had hung up. Then I heard him take a breath, slow and heavy, like a man setting down something he had been carrying for a long time. He said, "I have owed your uncle that for 10 years. I will be there." The morning of the inspection, Freddie and I were at the garage before the sun was all the way up. Walt had cleaned the place top to bottom. The concrete floors were swept, the tools organized on their hooks, the workbenches wiped down. Walt was pacing near the bay doors, his hands opening and closing at his sides. The inspector showed up right at 9, a man in a county polo with a clipboard. He started going through his checklist without much small talk. Walt followed him around the shop silently while he checked outlets and measured clearances and wrote things down. I stood outside by my car with my hands shaking so bad I had to shove them in my jacket pockets. 20 minutes went by, 30. Freddie had his phone in his hand, but he wasn't looking at it. We didn't talk. There was nothing to say that would help. The inspector's truck sat right at the entrance, and every time I looked at it, I thought about Julius calling Nia in that official voice, like he was doing Walt a favor by letting him know the trap was set, like the whole thing was routine, and Walt was the one being unreasonable for not seeing it that way. Then I heard tires on gravel and turned around. A beat-up old Buick pulled in. Liu got out moving faster than I had ever seen a man his age move. He walked straight to Walt, and while the inspector was still inside, Liu stood in front of my uncle and said, "Walt, I never paid you $1 in 10 years, and you never once made me feel bad about it. I am ashamed of that. I came here to say so." He held out an envelope. Walt started to push it back, and Liu said, "You will not take this from me. I owe you this and more." Walt took the envelope. His hand was shaking. Behind Liu, more cars pulled in. The single moms who used to hand Walt $40 for a brake job. The school bus driver with his old pickup. A woman whose car Walt had fixed on Christmas Eve 6 years ago when no other shop in the state was open. One woman walked up holding a mason jar full of coins and set it on the workbench without a word. A man in a faded work jacket handed Walt a check and said, "It's $50. It's all I can spare, but I wanted you to know I remembered." The inspector came out of the shop and found Walt standing in the middle of all these people. He looked at his clipboard and told Walt there were 2 minor issues, a missing fire extinguisher bracket and a vent that needed adjusting. Nothing that required shutting down. Conditional pass, 30 days to fix the small stuff. Walt stood completely still in the middle of that gravel lot, holding a stack of envelopes and a jar of coins, surrounded by people who had almost nothing and gave what they could, and he broke. Not loud. No sound at all, really. Just tears running down his face while he nodded and said, "Thank you. Thank you." Julius never showed up. Neither did Heloise. Neither did Doug or Linda or Joe. The fundraiser reached just over $9,000, almost all of it from people who could barely afford to give. Walt used it to fix the vent, buy the fire extinguisher bracket, and stock enough parts to keep working through the summer. He kept the price list on the wall. He kept the summary right next to it. Linda never came back to schedule her daughter's inspection. Joe's diner started losing regulars after a new breakfast place opened out near the highway exit. And one morning Joe came in and sat across from Walt at the counter and said he should have done more. Walt didn't say it was okay because it wasn't. He just nodded and left his usual tip and went back to work. Walt sleeps in a small apartment above the borrowed garage now. The owner rented it to him for almost nothing, and Walt fixed the man's truck twice for free before he finally stopped accepting that arrangement and paid the listed price like anyone else. Walt still works slower than he used to because he is 63 and his back hurts. When someone who cannot pay shows up, he still looks them over, tells them what is wrong, fixes it, and asks what they can do. He charges the people who can afford it exactly what the work is worth. He does not negotiate. Doug came back when the highway shop charged him double. Walt did the work. Doug counted out the bills and drove away without a word.